see it up in the screen there, and that's how we're gonna make a video of this so we can show folks who are not able to attend. But I think the nice thing to do is to wait maybe one more minute for more folks to come. For those on Zoom, we are gonna record. So I would say show what you wanna show or don't. But prepare for posterity is what I'm getting at here. So I'm gonna go comb my hair. Is that there's a better way to say that for sure. For those at home, let me show you the NPR. You see, we have some friends here. Ever so awkward in our waving. So what's going to happen in a minute is I'm going to hand off to Keri. There's a quick intro, and then I hand off to Keri to run the show. I'm going to sit right here and watch. So if you all have questions in the chat and whatnot, I'll definitely bring those up, or I'll just say, hey, Katie, ask your question that's in the chat. And there'll be plenty of time for that towards the end, for sure. But we want to make sure that we get Keri the time to explain what she's done and give her lots of love, and then we'll get into a discussion. Oh, I really don't like how I look when I look like that.
We're getting way too many views of this.
Right.
Like where's the mystery? I don't want to know what I look like when I do that.
I know. I know. I wish I had my avatar on. On to our community of practice here in spring 2022. Wow, that sounds. Wow, 2022. My name is Mark Shisham. I'm going to serve as host and representative of our Student Affairs Assessment Initiative team here today. There's some other folks on the team who are here. Keri's on the team, and Gary's on the team, and Lupe and David and Betsy's here in person. So yeah, we've got a good representation of our team here. A couple of things before we get started. So we are recording. I want to remind you all that, so if you are on Zoom, what you're showing on Zoom will show as recording, although I will switch to speaker view in just a minute here, and we'll just see Keri and her slides. We are going to have some Q&A towards the end, both for the in-person audience here in the room, as well as the folks, and we'll use chat for that. So I would ask that you please don't use chat for chatting, but instead use it as a Q&A space, a question space. I think Dr. Bradford's going to get started here in just a minute. Oh, I did want to do our objectives really quick and just talk about how this is a series. So first of all, today you're going to hear from Dr. Bradford-Gomez, our American Indian Student Services Coordinator and Communications Coordinator for SIS&T. This is part of a series that we're hosting this year. All of our community of practice sessions this year are student affairs professionals who are either in their PhD program or recently completed a PhD program. So we are praising our student affairs scholars. There are many more across the division. We've just selected three who are willing. Sarah Cook was our first, and she did that last month. And then Keri is going to be this month. And then next month, we have Dr. Brenda Curiel from EOP, who just defended on Monday. So she's not on the call right now, but love to Brenda, and we'll hear from her on May 18th, which I wanted to point out to everyone. I will let Keri describe her project more. I think really what I care about is that, we come into these sessions with clear learning outcomes. Today, the learning outcomes will be that you will recognize Native students' perception of the history of Indian education and how they feel connected to that historical trauma. And also there'll be some interpretation of Native students' perceptions of the ways that university staff, faculty, and administrators could better serve our Native students. This is obviously very applicable to the work of student affairs professionals across campus, and a reminder to all of us that our work is research worthy. So with that, please join me. I'm gonna make the view, close this, and make the view our speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keri Bradford, everyone. Dr. Bradford. And there's Keri, and we're recording, and I'm going to mute and let her take the stage. Here we go.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I really miss y'all. I wish I could see you in person. But yeah, thanks for joining today. before we begin, I want to acknowledge and give appreciation to my Chumash, my Gabrielino Quiche, and my Tongva relatives, in whose unceded territories I have lived and worked and learned and benefited from during my academic journey and my daily work. Today, we're going to quickly travel back 143 years. That's when the first federally run off-reservation Indian boarding school opened. The history's a real bummer. I'm just gonna say that up front. But then we'll zoom back to the present day and we're gonna learn how Native college students experience education. At any time, I'm comfortable with at any time if you wanna unmute and join the conversation, please. I'm happy with that, or yeah, we can save it till the end, just whatever. But I do hope it's a conversation. Sometime today, I'd love to hear ideas on ways that you think we could better serve Native students. So anyway, with all that, let's go and get started. So from the point of contact in 1492 to the end of the Indian Wars in 1890, 95% of Turtle Island was wiped out, the population. And in the 19th century, in what is now called the United States, the surviving Native people were removed from their ancestral homelands. We were relocated to undesired lands. That's my tribe's history. We were removed during the Trail of Tears. I'm from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Or we were, removed onto other tribes, unceded territories, or we were rounded up and put into reservations. And this was all, for the purposes of settler expansion, particularly moving west. So to address the remaining Indian problem, and these are not my words, these are words that were used at the time. So to address the remaining Indian problem, those of us who were left, in this case, my ancestors, the US government enacted policies to forcibly remove Native children from their families and put them into church and government-run Indian or boarding schools, where the goal was to assimilate us and so that we would adopt civilized ways of life. The irony is not lost on any of us that a lot of these practices were not civilized in nature, but that's for another day. So the first federally run off-reservation Indian boarding school, it opened in 1879. So that's 143 years ago. It was founded by this guy, the US Army Captain Richard Pratt. And he had just completed a 3-year assimilation experiment on 72 Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Arapaho, and Caddo prisoners of war at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. After his 3-year experiment was completed, it was declared a success by the US government, and they ordered Pratt to supervise what they called the Education Project. And so within 2 years, Pratt opened up the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And that's where this photo was taken. It was taken in 1900, where young Native children, you can see, are wearing militaristic style uniforms in place of their tribal regalia. And in schools like this, again, in the name of civilization or civilizing us, the children's appearances were changed. You can see they were given anglicized names. They were forbidden from speaking their heritage languages. Side note, a lot of the US depended on some of us remembering and using our heritage languages years later, in the First and Second World Wars as code talkers. But in this case, back then, attendees were forbidden from speaking the heritage languages. They were learning English and Christianity by force, and they were put to work doing hard labor on campuses. And often the schools were overcrowded, diseases were rampant, and children were starving. Children who disobeyed were locked in schools, the school jails, or beaten or worse. Thousands of children died in the schools before ever seeing their families again, as families were forbidden from visiting their children on campus. And I recently went back and toured one of the resident schools, the boarding schools that's back where my tribe is located in Southeast Oklahoma. And it's really hard seeing, excuse me, seeing cemeteries on on school campuses. That shouldn't feel normal or natural to anyone. So it's hard, visiting these places. So my study looked at what happened at those Indian boarding schools. The history of education wasn't brought to our people in a good way. What's happening for Native students today, particularly at the university. And this study has personal significance, but also professional significance, because I'm sure many of you join me, we're concerned about Native students' low enrollment numbers in college and even lower degree completion rates. And I think educators can do a better job of serving Native students. So recent data show that Native students make up 0.8% of the total student population enrolled in a domestic college or university. And if we look only within the Native population, we see that in 2019, 24% of Native people ages 18 to 24 were enrolled in college. It's worth noting that in 2010, that number was 41%. So I'm not really sure what happened in those 9 years. And then data show that in 2020, only 16% of Native people had earned a bachelor's degree or higher. For this study, I wanted to find out if there was a connection between the Indian boarding school histories and that intergenerational trauma and what today's Native students are experiencing in education. I wanted to know how Native students perceived their university experiences and how their intersectional identities influenced or were influenced by their perceptions. And then I wanted to know if ways that Native students perceived that universities and colleges can better serve them. So we're going to cruise through my lit review, but it focused on 3 key areas. Again, one was the history of Indian education, how it was brought to our people. One is on Indigenous research methodologies, which are similar, sort of, to traditional Western research methodologies that we learn in grad school or, well, in college, but different enough they're culturally responsive. And then also, how do Native students experience belongingness at the university? What does that look like, particularly for Native students? So I've summarized all of that lit review into just a couple of points each. Regarding the history of Indian boarding schools, I've shared a lot already. But again, the punishments were liberal and harsh. Children, who disobeyed again were experienced, multiple kinds of forms of abuse. Those who got sick, died, were fatally abused, were buried at the school's on-site cemeteries, which I shared. Some children managed to escape. These are sort of in the darkest days, the darkest periods of the Indian boarding schools. Some managed to escape, but if they made it back home, many of them were unrecognizable to their families because their appearances had been changed so much, and some lost connections to their heritage languages and didn't really know how to speak or how to communicate with their families and their tribal communities. Later in life, historical trauma showed up for many boarding school survivors and their descendants in the forms of substance abuse or continued violence. Lots of Native families are working to sort of break those cycles of violence now. In the Indigenous research methodologies section of my lit review, I shared some examples of very specific theoretical frameworks like the tribal critical race theory, some others, and I explained why it's important to use Indigenous research approaches whenever you're working within Native and Indigenous communities. Some responsibilities that Native researchers like myself have include privileging and protecting Indigenous knowledge ways. Not everything is intended to be shared. So protecting or kind of keeping that knowledge, consulting and co-creating meaningful knowledge with tribal members to their benefit that will continue their self-determination, and not kind of absorbing it and declaring myself the expert. And it's not my knowledge to own. It's and then lastly, in the belongingness section, I discussed many of the misperceptions held about Native people, starting with myth that Native people no longer exist, or other assumptions that contributed toward Native students feeling unsafe, invalidated, tokenized, or that they don't really belong in school. According to the literature, the reason for this feeling of otherness is due in part to conflicting worldviews. Native students often find themselves correcting or defending Indigenous people's experiences and knowledge ways. And in this section, I also explored elements of Native students' intersectional identities. Since we're all dynamic humans, looking at Native students' intersectional identities, I wanted to look at what the difference was between being an urban Indian, a rural Indian, or a reservation Indian, being multiracial or multi-tribal. And then there's always the looking Indian, well, you don't look Indian, looking at those misperceptions, and looking at diversity in gender and sexuality, and then also diversity in religious and spiritual beliefs and practices. So mine was a qualitative study. It used a mix of Indigenous and Western approaches in the data gathering process. I used predominantly Indigenous research approaches. In the analysis, I used Western. Due to COVID-19, all interviews took place over Zoom. That was a bummer, but and my research site was centered at a large public university in California. This is a tract of tribal land, wink. This study addressed two main research questions, and the first examined today's Native students' university experiences along their intersectional identities, their understandings about the Indian boarding schools, their perceptions about present-day gaps and challenges at the university. And then the second research question examined how today's Native students perceive ways the university could better serve them. For this study, I interviewed 5 undergraduate student members of a 52-year-old student organization that I call the American Indian Student Organization, or ASO for short. That's a pseudonym, and also 2 alumni members of the club. So let's meet them. Throughout this study, I referred to my interviewees as my or our relatives, in keeping with an Indigenous approach. Along the top row of the table here, from left to right, I guess on Zoom, left to right, are our 5 undergraduate relatives, whom I called Margot, Theta, Phyllis, Jean, and Marcos, and also our 2 alumni relatives, whom I called Wainona and Dennis. And these are, again, all pseudonyms, but they're also the real names of leaders from each relative's particular tribe. If you look down the rows from top to bottom, we see that 5 of our 7 relatives were first-gen students. None of the undergraduates in this particular study transferred into the university, but both alumni did. We see their majors. We note that 3 of them minored in the American Indian and Indigenous Studies minor at this university. Their GPAs ranged from 3.2 to 4.0. The length of time spent as a member in the ASO student club ranged from 1.5 years to 3.5 years for the undergrads, and for 5 to 7 years for the alumni, because membership doesn't end in the student club once you graduate. And then 5 of the 7 reported having trouble finding ASO, the student club, once they got to campus. They didn't really know where to find a student org that met their cultural needs. So they had trouble finding it. 4 of them flatly said they did not feel safe or confident to be themselves on campus with their Native identities centered. 2 others felt safe, but expressed some reservations about it. And only 1 strongly said yes, that he felt safe and confident to fully be himself on campus. This second table shows our relatives' tribal affiliations. And it also shows their affiliations with other races or ethnicities or cultures, and to which of their ethnic identities they felt most connected. 3 of them were raised in an urban setting. 1 was raised in an exclusively rural setting, and 3 were raised in a rural setting that was near at least 1 Indian reservation. It may have been their reservation, it may have been another tribe's reservation. 3 of our relatives identified as members of the LGBTQ+ community or as Two-Spirit. All relatives knew about the history of the Indian boarding schools, and 4 of our relatives had either relatives or elders that they personally knew who had attended. 2 of them were unsure if they had relatives who attended the Indian boarding schools. One told a story about how her relatives took really great care to avoid being kidnapped and taken away to the schools. All but one of our relatives spoke at least some of their heritage languages. All practiced some elements of some tribes' ceremonial practices. So some of the members of this student club that I interviewed had talked about being welcomed by a local tribe where this university is situated and being exposed, taught, shared some of that tribe ceremonial practices. And so all of them practiced at least some element of their own or another tribe's ceremonial practices. Only two of them were able to practice their own tribe ceremonies, but only when they were with their families back home in their ancestral homelands. Then, according to our relatives, many people in the general campus community assumed that Native people were extinct. This included many professors who talked about Native people exclusively in the past tense. So, Indians this, American Indians that, they were, they did, past tense. So our relatives resented feeling pressured to prove their indigeneity and being, questioned whenever they did express their indigeneity in class or dining commons, the residence halls. Our relatives blamed others' lack of awareness and misperceptions on some remaining colonial elements like the blood quantum theory, or, are you a card carrying, certificate degree of Indian blood, card carrying Indian, what does that mean? Then often when our relatives' Indigenous identities were acknowledged, others' reactions quickly turned to fascination or fetishization. It's hard to say. You see it here when Theta's talking about, they think we're a Halloween costume, or bring your, it shows up at Coachella or whatever music festival. Then lastly, our relatives reported sometimes being ridiculed or belittled or hearing racist remarks when they expressed their indigeneity on campus, which made it feel risky for them to identify as Native. And I'll give you a moment just to skim some of the bolded parts of these quotes. These are, again, from our student relatives that participated in this study. I think what I was hearing, I'm only sharing a sample of quotes here, but I was hearing a lot of folks feeling like they were not made to feel like they belonged, at the university or with their peers. Margot says, we've been kicked down to the ground, and before we can get up, next generation's kicked down again. So, we're like, I've never met a Native American. and Marcus here is like, you probably have, you probably just didn't know it. So a lot of assumptions about what that looks like and how that presents that identity. I thought it was significant that all 7 of our relatives interviewed for the study reported knowing the history of the Indian boarding schools. And in this study, we found that all but one of them reported still feeling the effects of that historical trauma. I think it was Winona, an alum, talked about whenever, Native students already come to campus carrying such a burden on their shoulders, they walk around knowing this history. And that really stuck with me, because I doubt that many other college students walk around campus thinking about their ancestrals' educational experiences. But here in this study, it indicates that Native students do. They come to college already knowing this. And so 4 of our relatives had firsthand accounts of intergenerational trauma, meaning that they had a relative or an elder that was at one of the Indian boarding schools. But I think here it's Dennis, who's an alum of the student club, who felt maybe most strongly connected to it. I'll give you a moment to skim the bolded parts of his quote. So here he's directly connecting. I mean, he names a connection, a perceived connection between the history of the Indian boarding schools and today's experience in the classroom, for him when he was a student at this university. And here, I think that it's for him, it's just a matter of making sure you pass this class. You got to pass this class. And that's a common concern for students. Having just recently been one, I can attest, you get worried about that stuff. We know our students are strong and they're under a lot of pressure and, different kinds of pressure. But here, we're seeing that Dennis is equating that to a life or death situation. We're seeing that he goes into survival mode. I gotta make sure, I gotta play this game so that I can pass this class. If I make my instructors mad, that might affect my grade and I don't feel safe. And, so he's taking, to me, this was an example, kind of an extreme example of Dennis, how Dennis directly made that connection to the Indian boarding schools. He named it and was pretty severe. 3 of our relatives had secondhand accounts of trauma, meaning that they knew the history of the Indian boarding schools, but they either didn't have or were not sure if they had a relative who attended. One of these was Winona. I mentioned her earlier. I'll give you a moment to skim the bolded parts here of her quote. So here Winona's, to me, demonstrating the connection with the history of the Indian boarding schools, and that she's saying she doesn't believe that education's really changed much for Native students in, boarding schools have been around since 1500s, but my study really focused on what's happened since the first off-reservation federally run schools open, and that was 143 years ago. We still have a couple of those open, even here in California. Of course, they've changed quite a bit, and now a lot of the schools are the curriculum and everything's developed in partnership with the tribes on whose lands, they're nearby. But here we're seeing how Winona is saying it's still trying to break us down, it's still trying to assimilate us, it's still trying to disband, to leave school, to leave our tribal communities to come to school. It's still disbanding our ties to our community. We're asked to adopt a new, identity. It cuts off these ties to our traditions, our languages, our life ways. So most of our relatives said that they did not feel a strong sense of belonging at the university examined in the study. However, all credited the ASO student club and local tribal members with creating a safe and supportive environment. Again, I mentioned that the university in the study is sitting on top of tribal land. And so the members of the student organization and the ones who were interviewed for the study have, some closer connections with members from that local tribe. Otherwise, our relatives reported feeling isolated, ignored, erased, or tokenized, and said that Native perspectives were lacking in their curricula and classroom discussions. Our relatives also said they didn't feel safe and didn't have many culturally centered resources on campus. All relatives expressed frustration that the university in the study did not have a formal relationship or partnership with the local tribe. Again, those tribal members provided ASO students with the kind of cultural support that they wished for. If we look through some of these quotes here, Marcus is, believes that the university is supposed to be inclusive of everyone, but he feels so defeated sometimes, doesn't feel like it's worth fighting for. Winona again was saying the classroom doesn't always feel safe. She wishes that there was a cultural advisor or a spiritual advisor on staff, a place where Native students could go if they need a smudge, someone to sing a song, offer prayer, offer community counseling, and Phyllis reference some of the bodies, the bones of ancestors that are being held at the university in the study. And she says, they've taken these sacred objects, they put them in display cases and say, look how cool these things are. So, these are some examples of how this bothers our relatives. But when it comes to overcoming barriers, there was a lot of source or strength sourced from their indigeneity. And our relatives said that they turned to ASO, that's the student club, and to members of the local tribe to source that resilience, to help overcome barriers experienced on campus. ASO was described by all our relatives in the study as family, and that ASO provided students a safe space for celebration of their identities, for comfort, and for ceremony. Dennis calls us a family, the student club, a family away from family, and that some, of his fellow alumni from the student club said they actually felt more connected to the ASO family than they did to their own families sometimes. And those are, these are such important student development, years, and many of our students have to leave their homes and tribal communities to attend school. And so it sort of made sense to me that they would develop a sense of family with each other. Marcus says, even though we're so diverse and we come from different tribes and we have different experiences, we're all one. We're all a collective one as Native people. And Margot said ASO was really the only reason she could stay at the school and thrive. So both of our ASO alums talked about how they felt a shift happening from being a student enrolled in the college, being an active ASO student, and then to becoming a support for other ASO students, and how they looked at the current ASO students with pride, understanding where they were coming from, what they were experiencing, and how they were surviving. All relatives talked about how much the local tribes' support meant to them, and particularly the support of one tribal member whom I called Deb in this study. Our students here on the screen, they talk about members of the tribe coming in and welcoming them to the land, doing blessings for them, making them feel connected. Welcoming them, knowing that such horrible things have happened, on this land, that our students appreciated the demonstration of resilience and beauty. One of our students called Deb that she's kind of like her local mom here, and just super welcoming, not just to school, but here to be a good guest on their land. So now we're going to discuss how all these findings informed some suggestions for ways that universities can better serve Native students. And there were 4 primary implications that universities could consider in order to better meet the needs of their students. And those would include creating a Native Student Support Center or department. Several suggestions were put forward by the students interviewed in this study, and I synthesized that feedback for what an ideal center would look like to them. Everything from a kitchen to charging stations to a green space to grow traditional plants and medicines and foods. And if we have time, I can talk more about what that ideal center would look like to them. The second would be creating a full academic program. So the university in the study offers an American Indian and Indigenous Studies minor, but all of our relatives expressed a strong desire to have a complementary major program. So there's a minor, but not a major. Additionally, a full program could include a PhD emphasis, various certificate programs, perhaps on heritage language studies or tribal law or tribal leadership and governance. A ton of suggestions were put forward in this area as well. The third primary implication would be initiating a formal partnership with local tribes. So again, all our relatives felt strongly that universities were obligated to develop and maintain relationships with local tribes. That's in part because of the shared land use and dependence on the land and resources, but also because many institutions are land grant institutions. So our Native students felt like this is a responsibility that universities and colleges have to the area tribes. There were, again, many suggestions put forward in this area, but one idea was for universities and colleges or even divisions to create a paid tribal liaison position, so that members of the local tribe, would be compensated for providing cultural support services to Native students, especially if that's lacking on those campus sites, and to serve, also maybe these folks would serve as a tribal advisory council that could provide consultation to staff, faculty, and administrators on everything from curriculum to community events and just building that partnership. And then the last primary implication was for universities to create a path of services from pre-college to career. So lots of suggestions were put forward in this area, but some of the ideas were to expand typical recruitment areas to include Indian clinics and powwows, going where our people are, and to develop diversity training materials or, first year seminars with information about the modern Native identity and experience, and then intersectional identities, and then to connect rising seniors and Native alumni to careers in Indian country. So like a lot of our students know that you can grow up, you can be anything you want to be, and you can do it in Indian country, which means you can work with tribal agencies or reservations or government programs, federal government programs like the Bureau of Indian Affairs or whatever. Anything you want to do, you can also go and do for our people. So then here's a fuller list of short, kind of truncated, but a fuller list of the types of support that our relatives expressed that they wanted to see at the university. Needing a safe space kept coming up. They want to see more visibility, more Indigenous art on campus. If there's a mural space, let them at it, kind of thing. More awareness and training, stop talking about us in the past tense, let's talk about those things. The full academic program, hiring more Native staff and faculty, particularly Native identified or culturally competent, maybe psychologists and health practitioners, having more relevant courses, and perhaps teaching a course in Indigenous research methodologies, since we're a research school. I'm thinking about that for this particular university, but at any college or university, having more courses centered on Indigenous knowledge ways, a way, maybe a needs assessment survey, kind of how do we know what our Native students are doing, feeling, experiencing, and making investments in Native communities, very localized Native communities and their projects, and divesting from projects that oppose that tribe's wishes or needs in governance. And then, again, recognition and partnership with local tribes. And lastly, here's a list of references to the literature cited in today's presentation. I'll kind of cruise through it. But I wanted to mention that almost all of the authors cited in today's presentation and in my dissertation identify as Native or Indigenous. And that was really important to me and to my study, as it informs the study from our perspective. If you're interested in seeing a list of all references, because it's late at night and you're looking for reading, I've provided this bit.ly link right here, .ly/native reading list, and that'll give you access to my entire reading list that was used in the dissertation. And so there's all kinds of really good topics there. And I see Holly's got her hand up. Go for it.
First of all, Keri, this has been phenomenal. I have enjoyed this so much, and it's so important. As you were sharing the student suggestions, which yes. One thing that I was thinking, as I think you personally know, I work in the Office of Admissions in the undergrad, and I was just thinking, oh my gosh, this would be so wonderful to have students with this perspective, with this cultural knowledge in admissions, because these are sort of the new folks that we need. Our admissions staff often runs kind of young. So did you get a sense of what would be necessary for us to change to make a career in student affairs in general more welcoming, more appealing, and sustainable for these up and coming Native students? Because we desperately need what they have to offer. Because they have so much to offer.
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. The first thing that came to my head was, and this is my own personal experience too. I know firsthand the impacts of the Indian boarding schools from some of my relatives' experiences, and thankfully, they attended when some of the darkest days were over for these periods, but that's always been a part of my awareness. And, I just completed my PhD last year. I'm 43. It wasn't an easy journey. It wasn't easy getting through school the first time. And I went to school, my undergrad in Oklahoma, where you would think that that's where my tribe's located now, not our ancestral homelands. But I thought that there would be more Native folks at my undergrad experience, and there weren't. And having kind of hopscotched across the country and having fallen in love with higher ed, working in student affairs now for 13 years, and seeing the opportunities to get more involved, to make a difference. And I kind of think this is where a lot of folks I think this is part of folks' educational experiences, is they see like, oh, what if we could do something to make it better? What if, my experience, what if I could contribute in these ways? And I think that I happen to know that one of the relatives interviewed for this study jumped right into a student affairs higher ed program, a student affairs graduate program, because she also felt actually two of them did. Two folks interviewed in this study went on to pursue master's degrees in student affairs practices. I think that it sounded like that was a part of a lot of people's educational journeys. Whenever I was here in GTSC, a lot of folks participating were looking to change something or improve something, contribute back. And so there's that, where I think that just kind of organically happens. And then I think, I know that there's a lot of well-intentioned policies in place regarding identity in the admissions process, in any college admissions process anywhere. And I know we have to be careful about, I guess, recruitment practices and things like that. There's legislation about it and all this stuff, but it does still shake out that there just ain't many of us in higher ed. When I applied or when I began my graduate studies in 2015, I was looking at the Department of Ed. What is that, iPad? I can't remember the data set, where that year for the 2014-15, of any student enrolled in any domestic, US college or university in a PhD program, there were like 213 or 214 Native American identified students. And I was like, 215, I mean, there's just not that many of us. And so when I've thought about admissions, when I've thought about recruitment strategies, I've thought about how I happen to know that at our university in 2017, I started really looking at the data. And at that year, 40% of students entering in as first years who identify as Native were transfer students. So there's a lot of our people, or at least there were in 2017, a lot of our people coming into universities through the transfer route. And so that had me thinking of all these, like, oh, how do we connect with the EOPSs or any of these programs at community colleges in California to begin creating these pathways. And so I think there's an opportunity there, again, going where our people are. So wasn't kidding about recruiting at the powwows, or at the Indian clinics, or there's a lot of tribal, they're called TANFs. Anyway, a lot of tribal agencies that directly connect and have these long time connections to Indian families. So being more, I guess, a little more intentional about where we recruit from. And then I mentioned there are two Indian schools, and I'm using Indian, I'm using Native American, I'm using American Indian. We get called everything under the sun. I think if you ask any of our students or a lot of our people, they prefer to be identified with their specific tribal affiliations, but we get called everything. I think the Department of Ed calls us American Indian. So anyway, I guess being more intentional about going to agencies where they have these long established relationships with families. I know our culture is not the only culture or population that feels like when they come to school, they're bringing their whole families and their whole histories with them. It wasn't just me graduating that day last year. It was my whole family. It was my ancestors, and everything. So I hope that answered it. I kind of went off on a tangent.
Oh, yeah. It's almost a little, kind of what I'm thinking is there's almost a little bit chicken and the egg because our staff currently that I know of, our outreach staff, I don't think anyone identifies as Native. So I think on some respects, we don't want to step anywhere where we don't want to intrude.
Yeah.
So I'm almost thinking like, how can we open our doors to be more appealing and welcoming to any maybe newly graduated Native students who might be interested in trying this career, so that we are not intruding, and maybe we have a new staff member who's like, yes, these are my family members. This is my space. So it is a natural outreach, because we do try to, when we're doing outreach to certain demographics, we are trying to look like, who is a member of this community? Because we want it to be comfortable and not people like, oh, okay, here's another basic white girl showing up with a bunch of pamphlets who doesn't understand my family.
No, I hear you. And I want to say, thanks. I hear you. I want to say some things I'm really proud about being a CSB. I know this sounds competitive, but it happens to be true that of all the UC schools in the system, UCSB has at least, I mean, I kind of fell off the whatever, looking at the data the minute I graduated. I needed a hot break, but we tend to enroll the greatest number of self-identified Native students. So I feel proud that our campus is doing a good job of enrolling. And then, so we know that that's part of it, and larger, another part is the recruitment piece. And we have some wonderful services here on campus. And, at our campus, there is a strong group of folks and allies who are starting to make moves on some of these implications that I mentioned that, came out of study a year ago, but already seeing exciting progress in some of these areas. And then I also wanted to say that I've really, really, really treasured my working relationships with folks, many on this call, who have been more than willing to engage with tribal communities, go to some of the Indian college fairs, admissions has been at these Indian college fairs. And sometimes I would pop in and kind of table alongside of them, not having expertise in admissions practices, but being able to share a table and being able to identify myself in my heritage language and connect on that level, and kind of partner with like my admissions buddy or EAOP buddies or whoever, and being able to kind of do that, I don't know, not handoff, but just a partnership. So that's been my experience at this university with my colleagues, and I've really treasured that. Luther, I see you've got your virtual hand up.
Yes, first and foremost, great job and congratulations once again. I was just thinking, it's kind of like an open-ended, just wanted to get your thoughts surrounding, considering the history of the boarding schools and considering the history of land grant universities and the land grab project, which I relatively recently found out about. I'm going to post it in the chat so everyone can check it out. It's a great project. But considering that history, what do you think about tuition waivers at the UC for California Native students? There was just a student who reached out to me 2 days ago from Pitt River over in Nevada, asking, can I get, since I'm so close to the California border, my tribal lands, go into California, can I get in-state tuition? So I think that's something we're going to be working on hopefully soon. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I so love that. Again, 3 a.m, late night reading and you can't sleep. you're welcome to read my dissertation, but in there, I do in the discussion chapter, I think 6 or 5, anyway, I mentioned some of these examples like that, like San Marcos Community, California State University, San Marcos. To my knowledge, they were the first in California to create that kind of partnership with a local tribe, where members of the tribe on whose land the campus sits, were their tuition, I believe, and fees were waived for those students. Of course, like every student, you still have to qualify or be eligible to, for acceptance, admission, and everything else. But for the students that did meet all of the eligibility and the criteria to be enrolled at a CSU, if they were members of that tribe, there was that partnership in place. And some other schools are looking at something similar. Moore Park University, or Moore Park's school is working on a similar kind of partnership like that. And so we have some, I think it's chapter 6. It's been a year, but I mentioned some of those examples of where we've seen that done, and I think there's a lot of potential there too. And yeah, I think it does connect back to the land grant institution stuff, and that was 1862, I think, that policy enacted. And our campus here happens to be a land grant institution, so that means that they have certain responsibilities to the local tribes here. And I'd love to hear more ideas about that. In fact, I did just want to say, like, I do want to say Yokoke Choctaw, which is thanks very much in my heritage language. And I would love to hear ideas and feedback and questions. And I think we've got something there too. I'm excited that we might be pursuing some of that. Hey, Mark.
Thank you.
I just wanted to take a minute to praise you and give you some love. So if everybody can give Dr. Bradford-Gomez a little bit of love. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I'm recognizing the time, and I know, folks, I want to make sure I respect everyone's time here. So I think now would be a good time just to say thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I'll ask Gary to stop recording. And then if anybody else wants to hang out on the call,